The lights in the Roosevelt Grand Ballroom had never looked more beautiful than they did the night Simone Whitaker realized her marriage was over. 500 people filled the room. The Chicago Symphony Foundation's annual gala, black tie, champagne, the kind of evening she'd spent 12 years attending beside her husband while her mind drifted to patient charts and surgical schedules. The orchestra was mid-movement when she felt it. Every head turning toward the entrance, the music faltering like a held breath finally released. And there he was, Dr. Reed Whitaker, chief of cardiology at Northwestern Memorial, standing at the top of the grand staircase with his arm around a woman who was not his wife, young, luminous, leaning into him the way women lean into men they've decided to keep. His hand rested at the small of her back with the easy familiarity of something practiced for months. Simone stood at the bar with a glass of Barolo she suddenly couldn't taste. She had operated on hearts for 14 years. She had repaired aortic dissections at 2 in the morning while her hands were steadier than her life. She had sutured damaged chambers back to function, while residents watched her in silence, afraid to breathe wrong. She had saved hearts that other surgeons had given up on. She had not seen this coming. That wasn't entirely true. She had seen it the way you see weather changing on the horizon, a shift in light, something cooling in the air, but told herself it was nothing, because she was too tired to investigate, too deep in a 12-hour surgery, too focused on the next impossible thing to look at what was happening right beside her. Reed's eyes found hers across the ballroom. He didn't look guilty. He looked like a man who had been holding a secret too long and finally set it down. Simone turned back to the bar and asked the bartender for another glass. Her hands did not shake. That was 3 months before the ballroom. Before that night becomes meaningful, you have to understand what came before it. The ordinary Tuesday when everything first broke open. She had been reviewing post-op notes on a pediatric valve repair when her office phone rang. An unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. Her schedule had 40 minutes between a consult and a department meeting, and she'd been awake since 4:30. She answered. The caller didn't speak, just breathing, then a text message to her personal cell seconds later. A link to a shared folder. No message, no signature. Just, "You should know." Simone had stared at that text through the rest of her consult, nodded at the right moments, signed the discharge orders, and walked to her office with the particular stillness she used in operating rooms when things went sideways. Not panic, but a kind of narrowing, the world reduced to the next necessary action. She opened the folder. Photographs, 37 of them, time-stamped, geotagged. Reed and a woman named Brooke Langley, third-year pathology resident, at the same hospital where Simone had built her career, where she had fought for her fellowship, where she had become the first black woman to head cardiothoracic surgery in the department's 120-year history. The photographs began 9 months ago. They ended 2 weeks before Simone's hands found them. She scrolled through every image with the methodical attention she gave to imaging results. There was the restaurant where she and Reed had celebrated their 10th anniversary. He must have taken Brooke there within the month, because the background was identical, same corner table, same candles. There was the hotel in Detroit where she'd assumed he was at a cardiology conference. There was Brooke's hand wearing a ring Simone didn't recognize. Simone closed the folder. She sat for 11 minutes doing nothing. Then she pulled up Reed's calendar. They still shared it for scheduling purposes, had for years out of habit, and looked at every entry she'd accepted without question. Client dinners that weren't dinners. Conferences that weren't conferences. Late rounds that ended somewhere else entirely. 9 months. He had been living a parallel life for 9 months, while she operated on children's hearts and came home to a husband who kissed her cheek and asked what she wanted for dinner. Reed was in the building. She knew his schedule by instinct, the way you know the layout of a home you've lived in for years. She found him in the attending lounge pouring coffee, and she closed the door. He saw her face and understood immediately. "How long?" she said. He set down the coffee. "Simone, how long, Reed?" He told her. The number was worse than she'd expected. Not 9 months. 14. 2 months longer than the photographs showed. He'd been careful in the beginning. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you," he said. And there was something in his voice she'd never heard before. Not guilt, relief, like a man who'd finally been allowed to stop performing. "She's a resident," Simone said. "She sees me." He said it quietly, but it landed like a verdict. Not the department head, not the woman who's always 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room. "Just me, Simone. When was the last time you looked at me like I was the most important thing in the room?" She thought about this for exactly 1 second. "When was the last time you were?" He flinched. "I built this," she said, and her voice was flat and careful. The voice she used when a surgery had gone wrong and she needed the room to stay functional. "My research, my publication record, my reputation is why you got the joint appointment at Northwestern. My connections are why your clinical trial got funded. She picked up her bag. You built nothing. You leveraged everything I built and called it partnership. That's not fair. No, she agreed. It isn't. She walked out of the lounge and didn't look back. She called her attorney from the parking garage. The humiliation when it came arrived in the form of a Chicago Tribune interview. She read it on her phone at 5:45 in the morning over coffee she didn't taste. Still in her scrubs from an overnight emergency, the headline, Heart and Home, Dr. Reed Whitaker on balancing personal reinvention with professional legacy. The profile was warm, generous, photographed in the hospital's rooftop garden. Reed spoke about outgrowing a certain kind of partnership. He spoke about rediscovering his identity outside of being a supporting player in someone else's story. He said carefully and with practiced regret that when one person in a marriage is defined entirely by their work, the other person becomes invisible. The other person, she had 14 years of surgical innovation and he had reduced her to the other person. Her phone began ringing at 6:15. Colleagues who'd seen it, friends calling to say they were furious on her behalf. Her department chair, Dr. Lavinia Cole, texted, "He actually did this. I'm so sorry, do you need anything?" Her sister Bernadette called and didn't bother with preamble. "He planned this. This is not an impulsive interview. He's been setting this narrative for months." Bernadette was right. Simone knew it immediately, the way you know a diagnosis before the test results come back. She began searching, not the interview, but the trail behind it. A podcast 3 months ago where Reed had discussed the loneliness of being partnered to a perfectionist. A panel at a medical conference where he'd talked about finding your own voice when your spouse's voice fills every room. A profile in a hospital alumni magazine about physician spouses navigating identity. He had been building his case while she was in surgery. The divorce attorney, a woman named Cecile Marsh who had the calm demeanor of someone who'd witnessed every variation of human betrayal, reviewed the financial documents first. "There are some irregularities in the joint accounts," Cecile said, sliding a printed statement across her desk. Simone leaned over it. She saw the pattern before Cecile finished explaining monthly transfers, modest enough to avoid automatic flags, to an account she didn't recognize. 14 months of them, beginning exactly when the affair began. Not a large amount each time, but 14 months multiplied by 12 added up to something she hadn't approved, hadn't known about, hadn't consented to. "He was financing the affair on our joint accounts," Simone said. "Dinners, hotels, weekend, some gifts." Cecile's voice was neutral in the way of someone who had said this to many women in this same chair. "The account traces to a personal card in his name only. He was using our money. He was using community property funds for personal use during the marriage, yes. That has legal implications for the asset division." Simone sat back. Cecile continued. "His attorney has filed for a 50-50 split of all marital assets, including a claim on the royalties from your textbook and licensing income from your surgical technique patent." She paused. "He's claiming co-development on the grounds that you discussed your research at home and he provided feedback." Dinner conversation. He was trying to claim her work based on dinner conversation. "No," Simone said. "I anticipated that response." Cecile said and almost smiled. The settlement meeting happened on a Wednesday in March, in a conference room at Cecile's office downtown. Reed arrived with 2 attorneys and an air of contained certainty that Simone recognized. He expected her to negotiate from exhaustion, to want this finished quickly so she could get back to work, to accept less because she had less patience for process. He had miscalculated. His lead attorney opened with the 50-50 demand: assets, intellectual property, royalty streams. The surgical technique patent alone was worth $500,000 in licensing fees annually. He wanted a cut of every procedure performed using her innovation forever. "Your client," Cecile said not unkindly, "performed no research, contributed no clinical data, wrote no publications. The patent is in Dr. Whitaker's name alone because she invented the technique alone. What specifically is your basis for a co-development claim?" Reed Whitaker served as a sounding board and intellectual collaborator throughout the development period, the attorney said. He provided emotional and logistical support that made the research possible. So did her department's research coordinator, her chief resident, and her anesthesiologist. Cecile replied. "None of them are claiming co-ownership." Simone watched Reed across the table. He was looking at a point just past her shoulder, the way people do when they can't hold your eyes but don't want to admit it. "I'd like to say something," she said. Cecile put a hand on her arm. She shook it off gently. "I'm not doing this," Simone said, looking directly at Reed. "I'm not sitting here while your lawyers try to claim credit for 14 years of my work because you happen to live in the same house while I did it. I woke up at 4:30 every morning to make rounds before my first surgery. I missed 3 Thanksgivings for research conferences. I gave talks in countries I barely had time to see because I was building something that would matter. You attended the dinners. You came to the award ceremonies. You wore the right suit and said the right things and people assumed we were equal because we stood next to each other. She paused. That's not collaboration, that's proximity, and I will spend every dollar I have fighting this if I have to. Reed finally looked at her. You turned your career into a fortress, he said quietly. I was never allowed inside. You were allowed inside. You chose not to do the work it took to stay there. Cecil called a recess. In the hallway she said, you need to let me handle this. I know, I'm sorry, don't apologize. But they're recording everything. Cecile studied her. You have documentation of the joint account transfers? Complete records 14 months, good. We'll counter with 30% non-negotiable on the IP, full reimbursement of the transferred funds from his share of the marital assets. Cecile straightened her jacket. You're the wronged party here, Simone. We just need to prove it in a room. The gala. Back to the ballroom. The Roosevelt Grand had hosted the Chicago Symphony Foundation benefit every November for 60 years. Simone had attended 8 of them as Reed's wife, standing slightly behind him at cocktail hour, while he worked the room, drifting toward the surgical colleagues she actually wanted to talk to, meeting again at their assigned table where they performed the choreography of a contented marriage. She was going alone this year. Her publicist, she had acquired a publicist 3 months into the divorce, a sharp-eyed woman named Theodora Banks who had handled several high-profile medical institution disputes, and once destroyed a hospital administrator's reputation so cleanly that the man resigned without understanding what had happened to him, had suggested it. He'll be there with Brooke, Theodora had said. The Langleys are donors. She'll be on his arm in public for the first time in your social circles. She had studied Simone with the particular attention of someone assessing a problem. You can hide or you can remind every person in that room exactly who you are. I don't hide, Simone said. Then we need to talk about what you've been doing for the past 3 months while he's been giving interviews. What Simone had been doing, operating 14-hour days, back-to-back surgical schedules, the work she did when she had nothing left to do except the only thing she was certain of, what she had not been doing everything else. Theodora had spread a folder across the table. Interview request declined, conference keynotes turned down, a magazine profile that had been sitting in her agent's inbox for 4 months, a TED invitation she'd deferred twice. You went quiet, Theodora said not unkindly. While he was rewriting the story, you disappeared. I was working. You were hiding in your work. There's a difference. Theodora had sat back. Dr. Whitaker, you pioneered a surgical technique that is now used in operating rooms in 11 countries. You have a waiting list of patients who fly to Chicago specifically for you. You were named to 3 national boards before your 40th birthday. She paused. None of that is in the public conversation right now. His narrative is, we're going to change that. Over the next 6 weeks, Simone had given the magazine interview, had accepted the conference keynote in Houston, had written an op-ed for the New England Journal of Medicine on systemic credit attribution in dual-career medical couples. Nothing accusatory, just precise. Her research, her signature, her 14 years of documented record. Young residents had started tagging her work online. A medical community blog had published a timeline showing that every major clinical achievement from their hospital's cardiothoracic department in the past decade traced directly to her research. The comments section filled with female physicians who recognized the pattern. Reed's attorney sent a cease and desist letter claiming reputational damage. Cecile's response documented that every factual claim was sourced and verifiable. Truth is a complete defense in defamation law. The letter accomplished nothing except confirming that they were rattled. But the gala was different. This was their shared social world. The board members and donors and civic leaders who knew them as a couple, who'd watched Reed accept awards, at tables Simone had funded with her speaking fees, who'd heard the careful version of their separation and drawn their own conclusions. Walking into that room alone, 2 weeks before the settlement conference, was a statement she had no other way to make. Theodora had called the night before. Foundation Chair Arthur Kimball is planning to acknowledge your endowed lecture series in the opening remarks. I had coffee with his wife last week. He knows that endowment came entirely from your own funds. It did. He also knows the innovation lab in the new hospital wing bears your name because of your research grant, not a joint donation. Reed had nothing to do with that grant. A lot of people assumed he did. Theodora paused. Tomorrow night they'll know better. Simone had stood in her bedroom the night of the gala and looked at the dress she'd chosen. Not dramatic, not armor-loud. Clean, precise, the kind of elegance that needed nothing added to it. She had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing in a room wasn't the loudest thing, it was the thing that didn't need to be loud. Her phone lit up, her sister Bernadette. You don't have to do this alone. I can come. Simone typed back, I know, I'm going anyway. She arrived 12 minutes after the doors opened. Not fashionably late. Precisely enough to avoid the early cocktail rush and enter when the room was full and paying attention. The cameras at the entrance caught her. She saw the slight pivot of heads as she came through the doors, the brief recalibration in people's expressions. Surprise, then something more complicated, then the beginning of reassessment. She was supposed to be diminished. She had not gotten the message. Arthur Kimball found her within 10 minutes. Simone. He shook her hand with the genuine warmth of someone who actually meant it. I've been thinking about your endowment lately. The first Whitaker lecture was extraordinary. We had 300 registrants and the live stream crashed twice. I heard. I'm sorry about the technical issues. God, don't apologize. It was a problem of success. He studied her. You look well. I am well. You always looked slightly distracted at these things before, like part of you was running through a suture sequence. She laughed and it surprised her, real and unguarded. I probably was. Tonight you're actually here. She understood what he meant. 12 years of standing beside Reed in rooms like this, her attention split between the social performance and the work always running underneath. Tonight she was simply present, entirely herself, and apparently that was visible. She moved through the room, spoke with colleagues who asked about her research, explained, to 3 separate people, the logistics of the surgical technique and where clinical adoption stood internationally, accepted a request to speak at the Foundation's Spring Symposium. The evening was beginning to feel less like a performance and more like what it actually was. Her natural environment, the community she'd built, the world she actually belonged in. And then the orchestra stopped. Not gracefully. The way a piece of music stops when the conductor drops his baton, and everyone understands, without being told, that something has shifted in the room. She turned. Reed and Brooke had arrived. They were descending from the mezzanine staircase. She hadn't seen them come in. Brooke was in something red and deliberate, the kind of entrance dress chosen to make a point. Reed wore the same tuxedo he'd worn to their 7th anniversary dinner, and for a moment she felt nothing except the strange forensic neutrality of noticing a detail. The crowd parted slightly. Not consciously. Just the social physics of a room acknowledging a new configuration of people it had previously understood a different way. Reed saw her. For a moment neither of them moved. Simone raised her champagne glass, the smallest possible gesture, acknowledgement, nothing more, and watched something pass across his face. Not triumph. More like the beginning of a reckoning. Brooke followed his gaze and stiffened. Her expression, when it landed on Simone, was the thing Simone had half expected and hoped for anyway. Unease. Because Simone was not supposed to be standing there looking like that. She was supposed to be at home in her office, buried in work, invisible. Arthur Kimball chose that moment to step to the podium for opening remarks. He ran through acknowledgments in the practiced way of Foundation chairs who have done this many times. Dentures, board members, committee chairs. Then he paused, and Simone recognized the pause as deliberate. Before we begin this evening, Arthur said, I want to correct a public record that has, I think, gone uncorrected too long. The Innovation Lab in Northwestern Memorial's new cardiothoracic wing was funded by a single research grant. The endowed lecture series that bears the Whitaker name exists because of a single person's generosity. The clinical training curriculum we use to educate the next generation of heart surgeons was developed by one person who spent 14 years making this hospital better than she found it. He looked out at the room. That person is Dr. Simone Whitaker, and she is here tonight, and it is long past time that was said clearly in a room like this. The applause was immediate and genuine, and came from people who had known the truth for years and were relieved to say so out loud. So stood. She did not cry. She smiled with the particular composure of someone who has spent months being told they are diminished and finally heard clearly that they are not. Reed's hands were at his sides. Brooke's red dress suddenly looked like what it was, an entrance to the wrong party. Simone sat down, and for the next 2 hours she was the person she'd always been, in the room she'd always belonged to, surrounded by people who had never actually doubted her. Reed found her near the end of the evening, when the dancing had started and most people had moved toward the floor or the bar. He waited until she was momentarily alone. "Tonight," he stopped, tried again. Arthur didn't have to that. He did it because it was true. She looked at him evenly. "You spent a year telling this city I was too absorbed in my work to be a real partner. Tonight the people who actually knew us corrected the record. That's how truth works. I never said you weren't brilliant. You said I was absent. You said I was married to my work. You said being with me made you invisible." She paused. "What you didn't say, what your whole careful narrative left out, is that you were invisible because you contributed nothing. Not to the research, not to the grants, not to the innovations. You came to the dinners and accepted the credit, and when it was time to account for yourself, you found a way to make that my fault." He was quiet for a long time. Around them, the orchestra played something unhurried and lovely. Brooke is already talking about launching a dermatology practice, Reed said finally. She wants me to fund it. Simone looked at him. Is that a confession or a warning? I don't know. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before. I think I made a mistake. You made several. She picked up her bag. Cecil will have our final counter-proposal to your team Monday morning. I'd encourage you to review it carefully. 30%, no IP claims, full reimbursement of the transferred funds. It's fair. Given everything, more fair than you've been. She started to go, then stopped. For what it's worth, Reed, I genuinely hope you find what you were looking for. I just don't think you're going to find it where you're looking. She walked out of the Roosevelt Grand and into the cold Chicago night. The settlement was signed 6 weeks later. 31%. She had given slightly, he had conceded everything that mattered. The intellectual property remained entirely hers. The transferred funds were reimbursed from his share. Brooke Langley quietly requested a transfer to a different hospital before the ink was dry on the paperwork. A fact Simone learned from her department chair and filed away without satisfaction. The Tokyo conference invitation arrived in April. An international cardiac surgery symposium, keynote address, the chance to present her technique to 1,200 surgeons from 40 countries. She accepted it the same day it arrived. The morning before her flight, she stood in the apartment she'd redesigned for one, smaller, cleaner, entirely her own, and looked at the framed photograph she'd moved from the hallway to her desk. Not her and Reed. Her surgical team, the morning after a 16-hour pediatric heart reconstruction that had gone as well as anything that complex ever goes. 6 people in scrub, exhausted, grinning, alive with the specific joy of having done the hardest possible thing. That was the work. That was the thing no settlement could divide and no interview could reframe. Her phone buzzed. Bernadette. Go make something impossible look easy. That's what you do. Simone picked up her bag and walked out into the morning. She had built a career out of repairing damaged hearts. She had spent a year repairing her own. What she'd learned in the process, the thing she would not have known without the wreckage of the past 14 months, was the same thing she'd always known about surgery. The suture holds because of the knot. Everything else is just technique. She had always known how to tie the knot.